Margaret Wilson had always believed that family was the one thing money could never buy. At 76 years old, she lived alone in the beautiful home she and her late husband Daniel had built nearly 40 years earlier. The house wasn't extravagant, it wasn't a mansion, but it sat on valuable land just outside Seattle, and over the years its value had quietly climbed into the millions. Margaret never cared much about that, to her. The house wasn't an asset. It was where Daniel had proposed in the kitchen while burning dinner. It was where her children took their first steps. It was where birthdays, Christmas mornings, and countless family memories lived. Unfortunately, not everyone saw it that way anymore. Her oldest son Ryan was 52. He owned a struggling construction company and constantly worried about money. Her daughter, Lauren, 48, loved appearances. She spent more than she earned and somehow always found herself in debt. Her youngest son, Kevin, 45, drifted through life from one failed business idea to another. Margaret loved all three of them, she always would. But lately she had noticed something disturbing. Their visits seemed shorter, their phone calls seemed less frequent. Yet whenever the conversation involved her finances, their attention became immediate. At first she ignored it. Then she started paying attention. And once she started paying attention, she couldn't stop noticing. One rainy afternoon, Margaret visited her doctor for a routine examination. The appointment lasted less than an hour. Everything seemed normal, until she returned home. Ryan was already waiting on her porch. That surprised her. He rarely stopped by unannounced. "Everything okay?" she asked. Ryan looked nervous. "Actually, Mum, I got a call." Margaret frowned. A call from who? The hospital. Her stomach tightened. Apparently someone from the medical office had mistakenly contacted Ryan instead of another patient contact listed in their records. The message had mentioned additional testing. Nothing alarming, nothing serious, just routine follow-up. Yet by the time information traveled through the family, the story had changed completely. By evening, Lauren called in tears. "Mom, why didn't you tell us? Tell you what? That you're seriously sick." Margaret blinked. What? The misunderstanding had already taken on a life of its own. Kevin called 30 minutes later, then cousins. Then distant relatives. Everyone seemed convinced that Margaret had received devastating news. No matter how many times she explained the truth, people only heard what they wanted to hear. Additional tests soon followed. Nothing life-threatening, nothing terminal, but because of her age, doctors recommended several precautionary evaluations. That was enough. Rumors exploded. Within days, her children behaved as though she were dying. At first the attention felt nice. Ryan visited twice in 1 week. Lauren brought dinner. Kevin actually called every day. Margaret almost enjoyed it. Almost. Then she started overhearing conversations. The first happened accidentally. Ryan and Lauren were standing in the kitchen while Margaret rested in the living room. They thought she couldn't hear them. "We need to know what's in the will," Ryan whispered. Lauren sighed.
I know.
Margaret froze. Ryan continued. "If something happens suddenly, everything could become complicated." Lauren nodded. "Especially the house." "The house, of course." Margaret quietly closed her eyes. A familiar disappointment settled into her chest, not because they mentioned inheritance, because they mentioned it so quickly. Days earlier they barely called. Now they were discussing assets. A week later things became worse. Much worse. Margaret invited everyone for Sunday dinner. She hoped spending time together might remind them what family was supposed to be. For a while it worked. The grandchildren played in the backyard. People laughed. Stories were shared. Then Ryan made a mistake, a very revealing mistake. After dessert, he casually asked, "Mom, have you updated your will recently?" The room became quiet. Lauren immediately looked uncomfortable. Kevin stared at his plate. Margaret smiled politely. "Why do you ask?" Ryan hesitated. "I was just curious." Curious, such an innocent word. Margaret had heard it before, usually right before someone asked about money. That evening, after everyone left, Margaret sat alone in her favorite chair. The house felt quiet again, peaceful. But her thoughts weren't peaceful, they were troubled, because for the first time, she wondered whether her children saw her as a mother, or as an inheritance. The thought hurt more than she wanted to admit. Over the next month, her health evaluations continued. Doctors remained cautious but optimistic. Unfortunately, every appointment fueled new rumors. Soon people spoke about Margaret as though she had one foot in the grave. Neighbors asked strange questions. Friends offered condolences she didn't need. Even her children seemed increasingly focused on preparing for a future that hadn't arrived. One afternoon, she entered the dining room and stopped. Ryan, Lauren, and Kevin were sitting around the table. Papers covered the surface. Property estimates, real estate reports, tax documents. The moment they saw her, everyone became silent, too silent. Margaret looked from one face to another. "What is this?" Ryan answered first. "Nothing. A lie." An obvious lie. Margaret walked closer. One glance revealed everything. House valuations, inheritance projections, estate calculations. For several moments nobody spoke. Finally Margaret asked a simple question. "Am I already dead?" The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Lauren immediately looked ashamed. Kevin lowered his eyes. Ryan tried to explain, but there was no explanation. Only truth, and the truth wasn't pretty. That night, Margaret cried. Not because of money, because of disappointment, because somewhere along the way her children had started preparing for her death instead of appreciating her life. And deep down, she feared things were only getting started. What she didn't know was that the biggest betrayal was still coming, and when she discovered it, everything she believed about her family would be tested. The following morning, Margaret woke up determined to put the previous day behind her. She made coffee, watered her flowers, fed the birds that visited her backyard every morning. For a few peaceful hours, life felt normal again. Then her phone rang. It was Kevin. That surprised her. Normally, Kevin only called when he needed something. "Morning, Mom. Good morning." His voice sounded unusually cheerful, too cheerful, after several minutes of small talk. He finally reached the reason for his call. "I was thinking maybe we should review some of your financial paperwork." Margaret closed her eyes. There it was. Again. Not her health, not her feelings, not how she was coping. Money. Always money. "I don't think that's necessary." Kevin laughed awkwardly. "I'm just trying to help." Help, another innocent word people often used when discussing things that didn't belong to them. The call ended politely. But Margaret felt exhausted afterward, not physically, emotionally, because every conversation seemed to lead to the same destination. Inheritance. 3 days later, she received another surprise. Ryan stopped by unexpectedly. This time he wasn't alone. A real estate agent accompanied him. Margaret stared at both men standing on her porch, confused. "What is this?" Ryan immediately looked nervous. The agent looked even worse. Neither expected her to answer the door personally. "We were just stopped." The real estate agent quickly extended a hand. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Wilson." Margaret didn't shake it. "What are you doing here?" Silence. An uncomfortable silence. Finally Ryan admitted the truth. "I wanted to get an idea of the property's value." Margaret felt her heart sink, not because of the house. Because her son had arranged a property evaluation before she was even gone. She stepped aside, not to invite them in, to close the door, slowly, firmly. Ryan knocked several times afterward. She didn't answer. That evening Lauren called. Apparently Ryan had complained. "Mom, you're overreacting." Margaret almost laughed. Overreacting. Her children were planning for her assets while she was still attending doctor's appointments. Yet somehow she was the problem. Lauren continued. "We're just trying to prepare." Prepare for what? The question hung between them. Lauren didn't answer because both knew the answer. Prepare for her death. Margaret ended the conversation shortly afterward. For the first time in her life, she felt lonely despite being surrounded by family. The next week brought more tests, more appointments, more waiting rooms. Eventually the doctors delivered good news, very good news. There was no terminal illness, no life-threatening condition, no devastating diagnosis. Several age-related concerns required monitoring, nothing more. Margaret felt relieved. The doctors felt relieved. Unfortunately, her children reacted differently than expected. The announcement should have brought celebration. Instead, she noticed obvious disappointment. Not spoken disappointment, Subtle disappointment, the kind people accidentally reveal through expressions. Ryan's reaction lasted less than a second, but she saw it. Lauren too, Kevin as well. Tiny flashes. Gone almost immediately, yet impossible to forget. That was the moment something changed inside Margaret. For months, she had given everyone the benefit of the doubt. Now she wasn't so sure. A few days later, she visited an old friend named Eleanor. Eleanor was 80 years old and brutally honest, one of the few people who never sugarcoated anything. After listening to Margaret's story, Eleanor leaned back in her chair. "You want the truth?" Margaret nodded. "Always." Eleanor didn't hesitate. "They think your money belongs to them already." The words hit hard, because deep down, Margaret feared the same thing. Maybe I'm being unfair. Eleanor shook her head. "No." "What if they're just worried?" Eleanor laughed. "Then why are they discussing real estate instead of spending time with you?" Margaret had no answer, because there wasn't one. On her drive home, she couldn't stop thinking about that question. Why indeed? Why were they talking about houses and valuations and inheritance projections? Why weren't they talking about memories? Family? Time? Love? The answer became painfully clear, because one conversation involved emotional investment, the other involved financial investment, and lately, financial investment seemed to have their full attention. 2 weeks later, another incident pushed Margaret over the edge. She arrived at a local restaurant for lunch. The hostess led her toward a table. As she passed a private dining area, familiar voices caught her attention. Ryan, Lauren, Kevin. All three were there, without her curious. Margaret slowed her pace, then she heard enough to stop completely. "What happens if Mom changes the will?" Kevin asked. Ryan sighed heavily. "She won't." "How do you know?" "Because she's always taken care of us." Lauren nodded. "Exactly." Margaret stood frozen, listening. Heartbroken, not one person questioned whether discussing her inheritance before her death was wrong. Not one person suggested spending more time with her, not one person expressed gratitude. Only concern about money, concern about assets, concern about future distributions. For several moments she couldn't breathe. Then quietly she turned around and left the restaurant. No lunch, no confrontations. Just sadness. That night she sat alone in her living room staring at an old photograph. The picture showed her family 20 years earlier. Everyone smiling, everyone happy, everyone together. Back then they didn't care about inheritance. Back then they simply loved one another. Or at least she thought they did. A tear rolled down her cheek, then another. Then another. The following morning she made a decision. A decision that would change everything. She called her attorney, Michael Reynolds. The same attorney who had handled her affairs for years. When she arrived at his office, he greeted her warmly. "What can I do for you?" Margaret sat down, then took a long breath. "I need to discuss my will." Michael immediately understood. This wasn't a routine visit. Something significant had happened. And after Margaret spent nearly an hour explaining everything, the attorney realized just how serious the situation had become. When she finally finished speaking, he looked at her carefully. "Are you certain about what you're considering?" Margaret stared out the window, thinking about Ryan, Lauren, Kevin, thinking about the conversations, the property evaluations, the inheritance calculations, the disappointment. Then she slowly nodded. For the first time in months, she felt completely certain. Yes, because her children believed they were preparing for her future. What they didn't realize was that Margaret was preparing for theirs. And the decision she was about to make would shock every one of them, a decision that would test whether they truly loved their mother or simply loved what they thought she would leave behind. When Margaret left Michael Reynolds' office, she felt surprisingly calm, not happy, not relieved, just calm. For months she had carried a weight inside her heart, a painful uncertainty. Now the uncertainty was gone. The truth had revealed itself, and truth, no matter how painful, was easier to live with than doubt. The following weeks passed quietly. Margaret stopped discussing her health with her children. She stopped updating them about doctor's appointments. She stopped volunteering information, not because she wanted revenge, because she wanted peace. Unfortunately, her children became even more interested. Ryan called almost every day. Lauren suddenly visited twice a week. Kevin appeared more often than he had in years. To an outsider, it might have looked like a loving family rallying around their mother. Margaret knew better. The timing was impossible to ignore. For years they had been busy. Suddenly they had endless free time. One Sunday afternoon, Lauren arrived carrying flowers. Margaret appreciated the gesture. She truly did. But after 15 minutes, the conversation drifted exactly where Margaret expected. "Mom, have you ever considered moving into assisted living?" Margaret looked up. "No." Lauren forced a smile. "It might be easier." "Easier for whom?" Lauren froze. The question wasn't supposed to be asked, at least not directly. "For you, of course." Margaret nodded slowly. Of course, everything was supposedly for her benefit, the house sale. The financial planning, the inheritance discussions, all for her benefit. She was growing tired of the performance. A week later, Ryan invited her to lunch. Margaret accepted. Part of her still hoped things could improve. Part of her still wanted to believe she was wrong. For the first half hour, lunch felt pleasant. They discussed family memories, old vacations, funny stories about Daniel. For a brief moment, Margaret saw glimpses of the son she once knew. Then Ryan made a mistake, a very revealing mistake. If something happens suddenly, Margaret immediately noticed the phrase, "Something happens not if, when." If something happens suddenly, Ryan continued, it would help if everyone knew your wishes. Margaret stared at him. "My wishes?" Ryan nodded. "Regarding your assets." There it was again, assets, not memories. Not relationships, not family. Assets. Margaret finished lunch shortly afterward. On the drive home, she felt older than she had in years. Not because of age, because disappointment ages people. And she was carrying a lot of disappointment. That evening she visited the cemetery where Daniel was buried. She often came there when life felt confusing. The cemetery overlooked a small lake. It was peaceful, quiet. The kind of place where people could think clearly. Margaret sat on a nearby bench and stared at Daniel's headstone. "You'd hate this." The wind moved gently through the trees. No answer came. Of course not. Still, talking helped. "They've become so focused on money." Tears filled her eyes. "I don't know where we went wrong." For nearly an hour she sat there, remembering, thinking, praying. And when she finally left, she had made another decision. A bigger one. A more important one. The next morning she contacted several charities, children's hospitals, scholarship foundations, veteran support organizations, senior care programs. Organizations Daniel had supported throughout his life. Organizations that genuinely changed lives. Over the next month, Margaret spent countless hours meeting directors and learning about their work. For the first time in a long while, she felt excited, purposeful, alive. Meanwhile, her children remained completely unaware. Then came the family barbecue. The event would become one of the most important days of Margaret's life. Everyone attended, children, grandchildren, friends, neighbours. The backyard felt full again. Laughter echoed through the air. Food covered every table. At first, everything seemed normal. Then Margaret walked into the kitchen unexpectedly. Ryan, Lauren and Kevin were standing together. They didn't see her immediately, and what she heard next broke her heart. Ryan sighed heavily. "Hopefully the will is straightforward." Kevin nodded. "I just don't want legal problems." Lauren laughed softly. "Honestly, I just hope she doesn't leave everything to some charity." The room suddenly felt smaller, hotter. Harder to breathe, Margaret stood frozen. The conversation continued. "I mean, we've earned it," Kevin said. "Earned it." The word hit her harder than anything else. Earned it. As though her lifetime of work already belonged to them. As though inheritance was an entitlement, not a gift, not a blessing. A right. Margaret quietly turned and walked away before they noticed her. For the rest of the day she smiled, Lord, played with her grandchildren. Nobody suspected anything, but inside, something had changed forever. That night she called Michael Reynolds. "I've made my final decision." The attorney sounded serious. "You're sure?" "Completely." The paperwork was finalized the following week. Every signature, every instruction, every detail locked it in place. There would be no confusion later, no ambiguity. No misunderstanding, only truth. Months passed, then winter arrived. The first snowfall covered the neighborhood in white. Margaret watched from her living room window. For a few moments, everything felt peaceful. Then her chest tightened, a sharp pain, sudden, unexpected. The coffee cup slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. Margaret reached for the table, missed, and collapsed. The ambulance arrived quickly. Doctors moved fast. Tests were performed. Specialists were called. Ryan received the first phone call. Within an hour, all 3 children were rushing toward the hospital. Fear consumed them. Real fear, not inheritance. Not property, not money, fear of losing their mother. And for the first time in years, nothing else mattered. When they reached the hospital, the doctor's expression immediately worried them. Margaret's condition was serious. Very serious. No guarantees could be made. The news hit the family like a freight train. Lauren began crying. Kevin sat silently staring at the floor. Ryan paced endlessly through the waiting room. Hours passed, then days. The uncertainty was unbearable, and during those long hospital nights, each child began confronting a painful truth. If Margaret died tomorrow, they would never get another chance to fix the past, never get another conversation. Never get another holiday, never get another hug, and suddenly inheritance seemed very small compared to regret, but none of them knew that Margaret had already made a decision months earlier. A decision waiting quietly inside Michael Reynolds' office, a decision capable of shocking the entire family, and if Margaret didn't survive, that decision would soon be revealed. A revelation that would change everything they thought they knew about money, family, and the woman who raised them. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady rhythm of medical machines. Margaret opened her eyes slowly. Sunlight filtered through the curtains. Everything felt distant, soft, peaceful. She immediately noticed 3 familiar faces sitting nearby. Ryan, Lauren, Kevin. All looked exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath their eyes. Their clothes were wrinkled. Their expressions carried something she hadn't seen in a very long time. Fear, real fear. Not fear about money. Not fear about inheritance, fear about losing their mother. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Lauren suddenly stood and rushed to the bedside. Tears immediately filled her eyes. "Mom." Margaret smiled weakly. "Hello, sweetheart." Lauren grabbed her hand, as if letting go might somehow make her disappear. "I'm sorry." The words came out broken, honest. Margaret looked confused. "Sorry for what?" Lauren started crying. "For everything." The room fell silent. Ryan lowered his head. Kevin stared at the floor. Because all 3 understood exactly what she meant. The missed visits, the selfish conversations, the inheritance discussions, the years they assumed would never end. Margaret gently squeezed Lauren's hand. Hen looked toward Ryan, her oldest son, the boy who once slept beside her bed during thunderstorms, the man who now looked completely shattered. Ryan stood slowly. Tears filled his eyes. Something Margaret had seen only a few times in his entire life. "I should have spent more time with you." His voice cracked. "I kept thinking there would always be tomorrow." Margaret felt tears forming in her own eyes. Because parents understand something children often forget. Tomorrow is a promise nobody receives. Kevin stepped closer. For several seconds he couldn't speak. Then finally the words came. "I was wrong." A single tear rolled down his face. "I cared too much about things that didn't matter." Margaret looked at all 3 of them, and for the first time in years, she saw not adults, not inheritance beneficiaries. Not people fighting their assets. She saw her children, the children she had always loved, the children she always would love. The following days became emotional. Doctors remained cautiously optimistic. Margaret improved slightly. Then worsened, then improved again. Nobody knew what would happen. Every day felt uncertain. Every conversation felt important. Every moment mattered. One evening, Margaret asked for privacy. Only her children remained in the room. No doctors, no nurses, no distractions. She looked at each of them carefully, memorizing faces, moments. Then she spoke. "If I don't make it." Immediately Lauren started crying. Margaret smiled softly. "Listen." The room became silent. "I don't want my legacy to be money." Nobody interrupted. "I don't want my life measured by property." Ryan wiped away tears. Kevin nodded silently. Margaret continued. "I want it measured by how we loved one another." The words settled heavily across the room. because everyone understood. They hadn't been doing a very good job lately, not until it was almost too late. That night, after her children left, Margaret asked to see Michael Reynolds. The attorney arrived the next morning. They spent nearly an hour talking privately, reviewing documents, confirming instructions, finalizing details. When the meeting ended, Michael looked emotional, very emotional, because he understood something Margaret's children did not. The contents of her estate plan would shock everyone. Months earlier, she had already made her choice. And now that choice was permanent. 3 days later, Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep. No pain, no fear. Just peace. The news devastated the family. The funeral drew hundreds of people, former co-workers, neighbours, church members, friends, people Margaret had helped over decades. Story after story emerged, acts of kindness, generosity, compassion. Lives changed because of one woman. Ryan sat quietly through most of the service, listening, thinking, regretting. Law cried throughout the ceremony. Kevin barely spoke. For the first time, inheritance wasn't on anyone's mind. Only loss, only love, only grief. A week later, the family gathered inside Michael Reynolds' office. The official reading of Margaret's will had arrived. The atmosphere felt tense, not because anyone expected conflict, because nobody knew what Margaret had decided. Ryan sat beside Lauren. Kevin sat across from them. All three looked nervous. Michael Reynolds entered carrying a thick folder. After offering condolences, he opened the file. The room became completely silent. Margaret's final wishes were about to be revealed. The attorney began reading. Personal belongings were distributed first. Photographs, jewelry, family keepsakes, letters, items filled with memories rather than monetary value. Then came charitable donations, large donations, very large donations, scholarships, children's hospitals, senior care programs, veteran organizations. Millions of dollars were designated to causes Margaret cared about deeply. Ryan exchanged a surprised glance with Lauren. Neither had realized how extensive her wealth truly was. Then Michael Reynolds opened a sealed envelope. Across the front were written 4 simple words, "To my children." The attorney unfolded the letter, then began reading. "My dear children, if you are hearing this letter, my journey has ended. Before anything else, I need you to know something important. I love you. Nothing I have done was motivated by anger. Nothing was designed to punish you. But there is a truth I need you to hear." The room grew still, painfully still. Michael continued. "When everyone believed I was dying, I watched carefully. I saw fear. I saw regret. I saw sadness. And for the first time in many years, I saw what mattered most to you." Ryan lowered his eyes. Lauren began crying quietly. Kevin stared at the floor. The attorney continued. "For a long time, I worried that money had become more important than family. Sometimes your actions convinced me I was right. You discussed my assets while I was still alive. You planned for inheritance before appreciating the person leaving it behind." Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The truth hurt too much. Then the letter changed, the tone softened. "I was disappointed, but I was also hopeful. Because when you believed I might truly leave this world, everything changed. You stopped discussing property. You stopped calculating value. You stopped thinking about money. And you remembered how to be my children again." Tears filled the room. Even Michael Reynolds struggled to continue. Then came the final revelation, Margaret's biggest surprise. "The majority of my estate will not be distributed directly." Ryan looked up, confused. Lauren frowned. Kevin blinked repeatedly. Michael continued reading. "Instead, it has been placed into the Wilson Family Legacy Trust." The room fell silent, the attorney explained. The trust contained nearly all of Margaret's remaining wealth, millions of dollars. But there was a condition, a very unusual condition. The money could not be used for luxury purchases. It could not be used for expensive vacations. It could not be used to pay off reckless debt. It could not fund lavish lifestyles. Instead, it could only be used for education, medical needs, family emergencies, new businesses approved by independent advisors, community service projects, future generations. The room sat frozen. Then Michael read Margaret's final paragraph. "My greatest fear was never that you would lose my money. My greatest fear was that you would lose yourselves chasing it. Money should create opportunities, not entitlement. Purpose, not greed. If this trust teaches that lesson, then every dollar I earned will have been worth it. Remember me not for what I left behind, remember me for how much I loved you. Love always. Mom. Silence followed, long heavy, emotional silence, then Ryan began crying, not quietly, not politely, like a little boy. Lauren wrapped her arms around him. Kevin wiped away tears. For several minutes nobody spoke, because there was nothing left to say. Margaret had already said everything. The months that followed transformed the family. Ryan rebuilt his struggling company honestly. Lauren became involved in the scholarship foundation funded by the trust. Kevin finally abandoned get-rich-quick schemes and started working with a community housing supported by Margaret's donations. Slowly, painfully, they became the people their mother always hoped they would be. Every year afterward, the family gathered at Margaret's house, not to discuss inheritance, not to discuss money, not to discuss assets. They gathered to remember, to laugh, to share stories. To honor the woman who taught them one final lesson after she was gone, a lesson more valuable than millions of dollars, because in the end, Margaret Wilson's greatest gift wasn't her fortune, it wasn't the house. It wasn't the trust, it was the reminder that family is measured by love, not wealth, and unlike money, love becomes more valuable every time it is shared.